This past weekend in the Into the Hellstorm 5 Grand Tournament, a pretty prevalent pro player was accused of cheating, even being given a game loss and a yellow card for their conduct during the event. But a question is still outstanding and is ravaging the 40k competitive community discussion right now as to whether or not their conduct was actually cheating, and whether perhaps they were overpunished. Let's talk about it. What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi. Today we're going to be talking about the interesting controversy over here from Into the Hellstorm number 5, the Bolter, a Warhammer 40k Grand Tournament. This is a 46-player GT held in the UK by the Hellstorm Wargaming crew. If you haven't heard of Hellstorm Wargaming, they are a pretty prolific Warhammer 40k and Age of Sigmar content creation team, doing lots of battle reports and stuff like that, and obviously delving into the competitive game occasionally to run their events. And this latest event was the cause of no small amount of controversy, as another 40k content creator was accused of cheating. This was Manny Chima from Glasshammer Gaming, who has been at the center of a couple little controversy and sportsmanship scuffles over the last couple of weekends, who in this instance was accused of intentionally scoring low in round 1 in order to give him a better placement in round 2. This is generally termed by the community submarining, which is the practice of trying to lower your score so that you are paired up against other players who also have a lower score in the future. This works because most competitive 40k events pair based on battle points or victory point scoring. So you are going to be paired with players in the same win bracket as you with a similar number of victory points. The idea is that that's going to give you the most even matchups throughout the course of the whole event, because you're going to be playing against people with a similar score and ostensibly similar skill. Although obviously 40k being as variant as it is, that doesn't always happen. Obviously someone can get a particularly good or bad matchup, or even just play into a list that gives up very few points, or play a list that has a tough time scoring in some situations. And you can organically have a low-scoring game in one round, which would then pair you with players who may not have finished their games, or may just not be as skilled as other players who will naturally score low. So it definitely isn't a perfect scoring system, but it is what the community uses right now. In this particular instance, Manny elected to choose to move off of objectives in order to score himself as few primary points in his first round as possible. He already had the win in the bag, because I think he had either tabled his opponent's army or caused them to concede, and then could solitaire out the rest of the game as he saw fit. And he decided to try to score as few victory points as possible while still maintaining a lead in order to grab that win, so that he would potentially be paired up against players with a lower number of victory points in round 2 to then give him the best chance of winning through round 2 and in future games. Now, before we get further into this discussion, I'll talk a little bit about submarining itself. I just described exactly how it works, but obviously it comes with some severe downsides. Because the final placement in most Warhammer 40k events that use kind of the standard scoring system is based on your victory point scoring, if you elect to nuke your own score in the early games and then end up losing a game, your final placement in the event is going to be basically as low as possible in whatever bracket you end up in. So if Manny had gone through this 6-round event with a loss on his record, because he had ended up scoring low in the first couple rounds, he would have been at the bottom of that 5-1 bracket. So in a large enough event like this, we can actually just take a look at the placings here. There were 5 5-1s, and Manny would have ended up at the bottom of that 5-0 placing, which is actually where he ended up because of some circumstances that we'll talk about in the future. If he had lost the second game, he would have been ejected all the way, down somewhere in 14th place or so. And because we're fighting over ITC points in these events, obviously, because you lose out pretty significantly on ITC points the lower you get pushed down in this ranking, that can hurt significantly. So while we're going through this discussion, consider that the move that Manny elected to make was a calculated risk. He was assuming that a lower score early would give him better matchups to give him the best chance of getting out at that 6-0, because he was going to lose a lot of real estate in that leaderboard if he wasn't just pushing for the highest score possible. Now, a lot of players in the community who are absolutely outraged about this particular conduct and, you know, how it was handled, I think on both sides. And it's obviously spurred an immense amount of discussion about the style of scoring that 40k uses and whether or not this could be considered cheating or could be considered poor sportsmanship. And let's go ahead and answer that first question real quick here. Is submarine cheating? And on the whole, the answer is going to be no, certainly not. Cheating is specifically a violation of rules or regulations. And I think we can all agree that unless the tournament pack says otherwise, intentionally low scoring is not cheating. So any of these people who's out on the internet comparing this to cheating or calling this conduct cheating, in my opinion, is totally wrong. Now, the real question, and I think the heart of the matter, is whether or not this is an unsportsmanlike move. And that really depends on your definition of sportsmanship. Now, Until the Hellstorm event referenced the ITC Code of Conduct in its Code of Conduct rules, which is famously sort of vague on its actual coverage of sportsmanlike conduct. The Code of Conduct in the Hellstorm Wargaming pack, as well as in the ITC Code of Conduct, talks a lot about the spirit of the game, which is sort of a nebulous and undefined term that you can't really assign any concrete rules to. Now, at its base level, sportsmanship requires, I believe, that players act with compassion and respect for one another during their games. I think regardless of the arena that you're in or the game that you're playing, I think that that is going to, generally speaking, be the accepted definition of sportsmanship. The question is whether or not a player has to go all out in all respects of that competition, and whether or not that's included in the definition of sportsmanship as being representative of fair play. Generally speaking, like I mentioned, it requires courtesy, good temper, and fairness. And I think the question of fairness is a really good one when it comes to sportsmanship. Is fair play the agreement with your opponent that you are both going to play the game to the best of your ability in all respects? Now, for some interesting examples, I looked around at different similar games and their sportsmanship regulations to actually have a look at how different competitive sports, for lack of a better term, approach this issue. Tennis has some specific examples, which I think is an analog to 40k as a competitive one-on-one sport. And there is an expectation in tennis that you give your best effort throughout the game, no matter the score. If we look to games that are more similar to Warhammer 40k, things change a little bit, and I think this is a difference between a more physical sport and a more cerebral one. In games like chess and Magic the Gathering, unsportsmanlike conduct is specifically defined as a social failing. For example, being abusive or bullying to your opponent in a way that makes them uncomfortable during the game. In these games, it seems to me that playing the additional metagame of trying to play for your future matches in addition to your current match may as well be part of the game, unlike a more physical sport where giving it your all and playing to your body's best ability would be considered sportsmanlike conduct. So realistically, the question of whether or not doing something like submarining constitutes unsportsmanlike conduct is still going to be a moot point and is still going to be open for debate until a figure of authority comes down on one side or another. We would need something like the ITC committee to come down and add a more refined definition of unsportsmanlike conduct into their ITC code of conduct over top of just this spirit of the game clause here. Now, in my opinion, when you try to govern mechanical gameplay by intention, things get a little bit awkward. For example, if you're playing against a newer player and you pull some punches during your game in order to give them a better time, that's clearly sportsmanlike behavior. If you are giving up units for them to attack, if you're allowing them to score additional victory points, if you're making the game tighter and the scores closer in order for them to have a better time, no one can argue that that's unsportsmanlike behavior. However, when you do it for your own benefit, it would potentially not be sportsmanlike behavior. And I think that just highlights kind of the awkwardness of trying to regulate gameplay using sportsmanship. In my opinion, the only real concrete difference between cheating and poor sportsmanship is that sportsmanship rules should only govern conduct, whereas cheating actually covers mechanical rules and gameplay interactions. A person can follow all of the rules to the letter, but still act abusively and obnoxious towards their opponent, in which case they would be unsportsmanlike. Whereas on the other side of the table, a person could be the nicest opponent imaginable and bend over backwards to make the game more fun for their opponent, but break all the rules in doing so, in which case they would just be a cheater while still playing in a sportsmanlike manner. These two offenses, in my opinion, should be responded to differently. Unsportsmanlike persons should be given warnings, and if their behavior is too abusive, they should be wholesale removed from the situation in which they are making other players uncomfortable, potentially by being ejected outright from the tournament venue. Outright cheating should be responded to with score penalties, which would be designed to counteract any advantage they may have received from cheating, and then lead to game losses or disqualifications if their behavior continues. Now, with all that in mind, I do think it's important to talk about Manny Chima's statement regarding the event. He talks about that he noticed that several other top players that he was expecting to score highly in their early rounds were using lists that were essentially hard counters to his own, which is totally fair. I mean, he's playing Adeptus Mechanicus, which is kind of the very top echelon of the competitive metagame, and I think a lot of people are going to be bringing specific answers for him. And so he sort of admits, I guess, culpability that he was actively trying to walk off objectives to score low and to try to dodge those lists in those early rounds. He also mentions that it's something that he's seen before in other games, with obviously that express trade-off that you could potentially be absolutely nuked if you do end up losing one of those games that we talked about at the top of the video. Now, according to Manny, he intentionally scored low in his first game and was then asked to stop in intentionally low scoring in his subsequent games, which I guess he agreed to. So a little bit of an addendum here. We can see that he scored kind of suspiciously low in round 1 and round 2, where he achieved a 40-point and 46-point win. In his third round, it looks like he's turned around his act, and this game ended up being very close, 79-73. And then in future rounds, he got big, huge 100-point wins, probably tabling his opponents. According to the statement, he said he was issued a yellow card and a game loss with a 0 VP score after the fourth round. So round 1 on the second day of the event, 24 hours after the original game had been played. Now, if this is the case, and obviously this is only one side of the account and is a pretty biased source of these events, it is pretty questionable that this ruling would have taken 24 hours to implement and that it was not taken care of at the time. Whether or not this just meant that it took a while to percolate through the judge team or additional information was made available to the judges, I don't know. I can't say. Unfortunately, I went through Hellstorm Wargaming's posts as well as the event pages themselves, and I didn't see any statement made from the Hellstorm Wargaming team or the event's judge team on this particular issue. So unfortunately, we don't have the other side of the story yet. It may be that it just took a long time for them to decide, or someone else had some additional information for them. Hellstorm Wargaming and Glasshammer Gaming both being relatively large 40k content creators. I don't know if maybe there was some egos butting heads there. That I can't speak to. But at the end of the day, this player was taken out of contention and punished pretty severely for their actions. Now, obviously, I think there's more to the story that will probably unfold over the next couple of days. I really just wanted to get this out and talk about it. But I do think that it really hammers home a requirement for some more concrete sportsmanship rules in ITC events. If events are going to continue to sort of religiously stick to the ITC code of conduct, we really need some examples of what constitutes a spirit of the game besides, just examples of players using sort of weaponized timing and being abusive to their opponent. As 40k becomes a more competitive game, and especially, as Games Workshop itself gets more involved in competitive play, just trying to make judge rulings based on these kind of nebulous concepts really doesn't work very well, and I do think that as a community we'll probably need to take another look at these regulations and give them a little bit of a bump up. Now, before I sign off here, I do just want to give sort of my 2 cents. Obviously, at the end of the day, the judges rule is law at any event, and I don't want to say that, while I don't 100% agree, I think, with Hellstorm Wargaming's final decision there, I don't want to, call it into question or anything. It's their event, and their judges made a decision, and that decision stands, and that's 100% how it should be. I do think, however, that instead of being a punishable offense, any score manipulation in this way should instead be sort of taken as a lesson by the judges. Basically as almost any rules inconsistency in a competitive game like 40k does. For example, a problem with a rule comes up in 40k, other players notice, it gets brought up to the FAQ team, and, eventually they come around with an errata or something like that. And oftentimes communities will come in with their own erratas beforehand in order to clear up the problems with those rules. And I think this is a situation that probably should have been handled like that. Manny used the scoring rules and the pairing rules to try to give himself better pairings in future rounds of a tournament. And if the judges didn't agree with that, what they could have done is just implemented, an immediate change to the rules pack and just say, that's not allowed. You have to play to the best of your ability in all of your games and, score as many points as possible where it's tactically advantageous. And, given Manny a verbal warning not to do it again. And I think that would have been fine, and that probably would have been the end of the discussion. Obviously, we haven't heard from the Hellstorm judges. There might have been additional instances afterwards where Manny was continuing, this behavior, and that's why they implemented this yellow card and stuff. But assuming that didn't happen, and that the recitation of events that we have is the case, then I do think that it was kind of overcorrected by the judges. In a competitive game, we can't really punish people for trying to give themselves the best chances to win. Were that to be the case, we could just as easily DQ people for just playing Adeptus Mechanicus because they were trying to give themselves the mathematically best chance to win from the get-go. And obviously, we can't do that. So especially in a game where the metagame and circumstances outside of the actual moves and models on the tabletop are going to influence the final scores of the game so much, I think that there has to be room in whatever policy the community comes up with for instances like this, where players are going to be able to affect their final placement with actions, both before and during their games of Warhammer 40k individually. I also think that this probably highlights a particular weakness in the current pairing system, and obviously a lot of people have opened up these same discussions elsewhere on the internet, where battle point placement or pairing systems are not particularly well thought out and don't really work that well. Victory point pairing systems are the worst pairing system except for all the other ones, and almost any way that you slice any of these pairing systems, there's going to be an issue with it. I've played a lot of games that have used strength of schedule style pairing systems, and those end up becoming totally random because who you get paired against, especially in earlier rounds, is totally random. And in later rounds, your final placement can be significantly impacted by who you were randomly paired with in the early rounds. If you pair against somebody who goes 0-1 drop and doesn't contribute anything to a strength of schedule score by the end of the event, versus someone, who plays the second place finisher in their round one and ends up being boosted by that strength of schedule. A similar thing happens where there's going to be, some level of randomness and somebody's going to get pissed off. In my opinion, I think that there is a weighted strength of schedule that can be used that's probably kind of a happy medium. I don't particularly love pure VP pairing systems or placement systems because I think the VPs that are scored during a game of 40k are pretty mutable, and obviously there's some sort of gamification involved. But obviously there's going to be positives and drawbacks to any form of pairing or placement system. Well, I do think that this might be kind of a warning sign to the community that maybe we should switch to a different system. I don't know if that's the crux of the issue. I think, as a community, we really have to come down on what side of the issue that we want to be on. Whether or not this kind of gamification of the competitive framework is going to be allowed at events or it's going to be discouraged, you know, with potentially harsh repercussions if you engage in it. And even if the pairing system ends up being changed and similar situations like this occur in the future, you know, we're going to have potentially a precedent to point to on how judges are meant to respond in a way that's acceptable by the community. Anyway, I've been super long-winded and soapboxy in this video, so I'm going to go ahead and close it off there. I thought this was an interesting discussion, and I think, and in terms of the grand scheme of controversies that Warhammer 40k and especially competitive 40k has undergone, especially, you know, even in the last month and a half, this is way down on the low end, and I think this is all going to blow over relatively quickly. I want to throw a real quick shout out to the patrons, obviously, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers, everyone who's supporting the channel. I really appreciate all of you. As things are opening up in my life, it's been a little bit more difficult to put out content on a more regular basis, and I think, honestly, that is just a balance that I have yet to strike in my life, and so I really appreciate all the people who are sticking around and supporting the channel as some things change for me, and I'm sure some things change for a lot of people in the 40k and especially online 40k community. Everyone out here is super cool. I appreciate everybody for watching. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the super long rambly video. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.